Hello, everybody. This Thanksgiving week in the United States, we've been, as always, perhaps in America, a little insular, trying to digest the implications of the Trump victory, what it means for America and what it means for the world. One man who is anything but insular or parochial, inward-looking, is my guest today. Kishore Mahbubani is one of Asia's leading diplomats and thinkers and writers. He's been on the show several times before, and he has a new book out. It's called Living the Asian Century, an undiplomatic memoir. And if there's one way of describing my old friend Kishore Mahbubani, it is as an undiplomatic diplomat. And I think he treats the word undiplomatic as anything but an insult. Kishore is joining us from Singapore, where he lives. He's just come back from New York. Kishore, before we get to the book, in your own uniquely undiplomatic way, how is Asia and Singapore digesting the Trump victory?
Well, I think all of us are putting our seatbelts on. We are preparing, when an aircraft goes into turbulence, the best thing you can do is put your seatbelts on and hope for the best. So we will have absolutely no control of what Trump does, but we will definitely feel the effects of the turbulence when he carries out some of his decisions. So, for example, if he goes ahead with major tariffs on China, it will certainly rock the markets and lead to all kinds of cascading consequences on other economies too. So everybody is getting ready for some challenges. But at the same time, I also want to add that having lived with him for 4 years, it's a bit less, there's a less trepidation this time around, because at the end of the day, while he may do some crazy things in some areas, he's not mad. He's quite rational. And so if he finds that the markets are reacting against what he does, then I think there'll be self-correcting mechanisms in the Trump administration also.
As I was saying, Kishore, you're sounding a little diplomatic, perhaps uncharacteristically undiplomatic in talking about Trump. You sound quite respectful of him, that he's rationally irrational. You're putting our seatbelts on, but you're suggesting that we actually can figure him out, or we can figure him out this time around.
Well, I think certainly for the countries of this region, we've decided that this is somebody we have to live with for the next 4 years. We don't engage in wishful thinking. The reality is that Trump will be president, and we will have to live with him. And we got to figure out the best ways and means of living with him. But at the same time, I should add that I think many countries in this region therefore also realize that we have to do more ourselves. So in this region, the process of regional integration will continue, because they believe the best way to protect ourselves from any possibly dangerous moves by Donald Trump on tariffs is to ensure that we keep on growing the trade in our region and we continue integrating with each other.
Is it tariffs that's the big issue? You talk about the markets pushing back on Trump, and in that sense, he's a rational actor. He's not crazy. Is it possible, or is there a sense in Asia that Trump might experience a Liz Truss moment and be brought to reality by what the markets determine? He can't accuse the markets of being fake news.
Well, certainly, I think, for example, most people believe that let's say, I don't think he'll do it, but if he just announces on the first day of his presidential term that he's going to impose immediately 60% tariffs on Chinese products, trust me, the markets will react very adversely to that, because the markets know how dependent the American economy is actually on imports from China. Almost everything that is manufactured in the United States today, in one way or another, gets components from China. There's a very deep interdependence there that most people are not aware of. And so it's going to hit American industries too. And if it's going to hit American industries too, it will hit the markets too. And so I think there are, in that sense, some checks and balances on what he can do and what he cannot do.
I'm not an expert by any means on this, but of course one reads a lot about China and the Chinese response. Some of the stuff I've been reading suggests that the Chinese actually weren't unhappy with the Trump victory. And in a sense, he provides tariffs with or without radical tariffs. He provides a little bit more coherence than perhaps Biden or Harris. Is there any truth to that? How I know you're in Singapore and you can't speak on behalf of China or the Chinese people or the government, but what's your sense of how the Chinese are responding to the Trump victory?
Well, I think let me make a statement that might startle your audience a little.
I hope it's undiplomatic, Kishore. Make it as undiplomatic as possible, please.
By far, the most sophisticated geopolitical players in the world are the Chinese leaders. By far. Because they're not thinking about just tomorrow. They're always thinking of where they are headed for in the next 5 to 10 years. So they are always thinking where they want to be 10 years from now, and then they carry out various measures to ensure that they head in that direction. So, for example, many years ago, they anticipated some kind of containment policy by the United States, and so they went out of their way to integrate themselves with the countries surrounding them. So, for example, I live in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. Can you believe it? In the year 2001, China proposed a free trade agreement with ASEAN. In fact, even though ASEAN is a pro-Western organization, no Western country proposed a free trade agreement, but China did so. And the result of that was that China's trade with ASEAN, Southeast Asia, went up from 40 billion in the year 2000 to 975 billion by 2022, making it the world's largest trading relationship. That's an example of long-term thinking that paid off. And in the same way, all these initiatives that the Chinese have launched, the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Development Bank Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank Initiative, these are all initiatives that are tying the world to China in many ways substantively. And so they knew that if a very difficult American president came along, they had to make sure that they had substantive ties with the rest of the world to protect themselves from such an American president. So, and of course, in the case of Donald Trump, they have very complex cost-benefit calculations. They know that Trump will apply a lot of bilateral pressure on China, but at the same time, Trump will also alienate a lot of the allies of the United States of America because he sees allies not as assets, but as liabilities. So all the efforts by the Biden administration to try and get the Asian allies to counterbalance China will be washed away to some extent by Donald Trump. So we know that costs and benefits for the Chinese when Donald Trump takes over.
You talk about the Chinese playing a long game, but what is that long game, Kishore? There are perhaps two narratives, certainly in the United States. The dominant narrative is you know it all too well, the Cold War 2.0 narrative that of Xi and his totalitarian ambitions to control not just China, but the world. With the war drums around Taiwan. And the other narrative, I guess, is of China becoming the dominant economic and perhaps even political player in the 21st century. Those two narratives aren't always compatible. What's their game? Is it Xi's game? Who's even playing the game these days?
Well, one thing I want to say, another startling thing for your American audience, which they should be aware of, is that there are 8 billion people on planet Earth. And the United States only represents 330 million people. The 330 million people in the United States of America have been captured by a very negative portrayal of China, and believe that China is out to dominate the world and China is a threat to the world. And one thing that Americans should do is travel around the world and see how the rest of the world views China. And they'll be surprised to discover that almost no other country shares this incredibly negative view of China that the Americans have developed of China. And Americans have isolated themselves from the rest of the world with their characterizations of China. Because if you look around the world substantively, most countries in the world are stepping up their links with China.
I mean, what about major neighbors, Japan and India? Do they have a more optimistic view of China than the United States?
No, I think it is. It is. By the way, when you live next to a country that used to be a mouse, small mouse, and remember in the year 1980, the U.S. economy was 10 times the size of China. Now it's only 1.5 times bigger. So in the region, the elephant has become a mouse. So the mouse has become an elephant. And trust me, of course, every neighbor of China is concerned about China's rise. But the question is, how do you manage China's rise? And the United States has decided to demonize China and put China completely in the negative ledger. But you will find that countries, all the neighbors, including, by the way, the two countries you mentioned, Japan and India, have actually stepped up their trade links with China. And India and China, as you know, have had a very bad relationship since June 2020, but they have now tried to normalize their relations with China. So most countries in the world have normal, traditional bilateral relations with China. They're not necessarily, how do you say, pro-China, but they're certainly not anti-China. They see China as a reality that we have to live with. So the American perception of China is not shared by the vast majority of the world's population. And I'm surprised how few Americans are aware of this huge reality that Americans have isolated themselves with their demonization of China.
There's always been a strong isolationist wing within both American political parties, also within culture. But what strikes me is that many liberal observers of China, we've had many of them on the show, people like Orville Schall, you're all too familiar with his work. They're also deeply fearful of Xi's centralization of power, the kind of system that he's building, and the treatment of many minorities in China. Are they just, are they articulating something that's true, or are they just anti-Chinese and paranoid like the rest of the Americans, Kishore? Because historically, people like Schall have always been rather sympathetic and hopeful about Chinese development. Are you suggesting that really most Americans are just patronizing or ignorant about China?
Well, it's interesting that you should mention Orville Schall, because a few months ago I had a very interesting debate with Orville Schall at the Asia Society in New York. You can watch the video on YouTube. And by the way, this had almost 1 million views on YouTube. My debate with Orville Schall. I think the debate I had with Orville Schall, I think, brings out very, very well the gap between the liberal American perception of China and the rest of the world's perception of China. And certainly the liberal Americans had some very unrealistic expectations of China. I mean, when they believed that if China integrated itself with the world economically, it would then become a carbon copy of American liberal democracy. Now, that was a bizarre hope, because, China is the world's oldest continuous civilization. It's 4,000 years old, or plus 4,000 years old. And the idea that a 4,000-year-old civilization would model its political future on a young baby, a less than 250-year-old republic called the United States of America, that was an incredibly arrogant, naive hope that Americans had about China. And of course, this arrogant, naive hope has been shattered because China would never have become a carbon copy of the United States of America. And here, if you want me to make another provocative point, it's a huge mistake that Americans are making to demonize Xi Jinping, the person, because the Xi Jinping, by the way, just so that everyone in the United States knows, is treated with great respect by most leaders in the world. When you watch him in his interactions with other leaders in the world, they realize he's one of the more competent leaders of the world. He's growing his economy. China is going through a bad patch, by the way. The Chinese economy is going through a bad patch this year. Next year, it'll take some time to recover. But overall, it's still going to grow by 5%. And if you look at the real economy of China, the real economy of China is investing in the industries of the future to a far greater extent than any other leading economy in the world, whether it's in electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, batteries, everything. China's investing in the future. So I think it's better to treat China as, frankly, as a serious competitor and not demonize it either way.
What kind of intimacy exists in your view, economically, culturally, between the United States and China? They seem to be doing an odd kind of dance. In economic terms, it seems that the two dominant themes over the last 30 or 40 years, on the one hand, a radical improvement in the quality of life and living standards in China, and on the other hand, this crisis of what used to be the American working class and what you would call it now increasingly an unworking class. Is there a dance of, is it a zero-sum game in some ways, Kishore, between the US and China? Can they both win in the 21st century?
Absolutely. I believe that the United States and China can and should both win in the 21st century. That's been the message of my book, Has China Won You? And also the message of my latest book, Living the Asian Century. Because at the end of the day, if you look at our world, Andrew, there are so many common global challenges that the world faces, okay? And number one being climate change, of course. And climate change cannot be solved unless the two greatest economies, United States and China, cooperate with each other. Trust me, these two economies have to cooperate if you're going to fight climate change. And then, we're having all kinds of other global challenges emerging, new pandemics. Look at bird flu that might come again. Look at what's happening, on the economic front, some challenges coming to the global economy. So there are many common global challenges that the world would like to see the United States and China cooperate in to solve these problems. And frankly, even if you look at American companies today, ask yourself, how much would Apple be worth if Apple could not produce its phones in China? How much would Tesla be worth if it could not produce its cars in China? I mean, it's important to do take a realistic view of how dependent the American economy is in real terms on the manufacturing of components in China, because the Chinese have created an amazing manufacturing ecosystem, the best one in the world. And I'm sure you've heard of Adam Tooze, this British
he's a Columbia University
Columbia University. And he just gave a lecture recently in Zurich where he said the first China shock was the one you mentioned, when China suddenly introduced lots of new manpower into the global manufacturing system. And it is a fact that many workers in the United States and Europe lost their jobs. And frankly, what they should have been provided with should have been worker retraining assistance, but they were not, sadly. And that's one reason why they lost their jobs. But he's now saying there's a second China shock that's coming, where the only way for the advanced Western economies to develop is now to copy China, because China is ahead in manufacturing. Now, can you believe it? That you used to be worried about the Chinese stealing intellectual property, stealing, intellectual property assets from the West. Now the West, he says, will have to copy Chinese intellectual property if it's going to succeed and grow in the coming decades. That's how much the world has changed. And this is why my goal is to give my American friends a more realistic view of the world that we have today, rather than the mythical view that dominates the description, the portrayals of China in the American liberal media.
It's enormously controversial, Kishore. And let's get to your undiplomatic memoir, Living the Asian Century. Of course, you weren't born in the Asian century. Tell me about your origins. Where were you born and when?
Well, I was born in October 1948 in Singapore, which was then a British colony. And of course, when you're born and then I lived in a British colony till I was, 15 years old. I can tell you that as a child in the British colony, I believe very deeply and very sincerely that I, as an Asian, I was intellectually, culturally inferior to the white man. And that I, as an Asian, could never be as smart as the British who were ruling Singapore so effortlessly. So the sense of inferiority that Asians felt was very, very deep in the middle of the 20th century. But what's amazing is that in my lifetime, and this is why I call it Living the Asian Century, in my lifetime, I've gone from the Asians feeling inferior to the West to feeling equal to the West, to now a situation where many Asians believe that in a level playing field, let's say in an Ivy League university in America, the Asians can outperform everybody else. So this is an amazing journey that Asians have traveled just in my lifetime, to go from feeling culturally inferior to feeling culturally equal, and now feeling maybe we can do better than anybody else in the world. That's a remarkable journey that many in the world are not aware of, that the vast majority of the world's population, which are Asian, by the way, Asians make up 55% of the world's population. That's a remarkable journey that has taken place. And my book tries to explain how that happened.
Is there something about the British colonial experience which you think compounds that sense of cultural, economic, political inferiority that you experienced growing up, which you've now thrown off? Or is that just a feature generally of colonialism? Presumably all colonizing powers, European, North American, even Chinese, bring out the same sense of inferiority.
Oh, certainly. I mean, when I look back, I'm ethnically Indian. And, it's hard to believe that 100 years ago, in the year 1924, 300 million of my ancestors in India could be effortlessly ruled by 100,000 Englishmen. And how did this 100,000 Englishmen rule over 300 million Indians? By making them feel, hey, you're inferior. You're not as good as us. We have the right to rule, and you have the obligation to accept our commands. That's amazing. That's, colonization, the most successful colonization is mental colonization. And lots of many Asians were mentally colonized. And so what I describe is how we were mentally colonized and how we escaped this mental colonization. And now it's amazing that, Singapore, when I grew up as a child, had a per capita income of $500, same as Ghana in Africa. And today our per capita income, $88,000, is much higher than that of the United Kingdom, our former colonial masters. And as you know, when Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were running UK after Brexit, they said, well, our dream is to make UK the Singapore on the Thames. So Singapore, we went from being a country that was colonized to becoming a role model for the United Kingdom. That's an amazing journey that Singapore has taken, which I document in Living the Asian Century.
And you obviously get particular pleasure out of that, Kishore. Is there a certain kind of ironic justice to this that the British have always patronized you? I mean, they are a very patronizing group and a very patronizing culture. That the experience in Singapore has turned this all on its head. Do you get a particular kind of satisfaction out of it?
Well, I think to be fair, the British have become less patronizing. As you know, the UK is in a very tough spot as a country. I mean, Brexit, they committed economic suicide by going through with Brexit. And I don't think the British are anywhere as patronizing as they used to be. And I want to emphasize, by the way, I have a lot of British friends whom I respect a great deal. And many of them, by the way, enjoyed and appreciated my memoirs. I mean, for example, Martin Wolf of the Financial Times.
Yeah, who's a friend of mine.
Gave me a ringing endorsement of my memoirs, you know, and he felt that I described the Asian journey as well as I could. And I want to emphasize that we in Asia, we are not anti-Western. We want the West to do well. We want America to grow and thrive. We want the European Union to grow and thrive, because frankly, the world is better off with strong, thriving economic engines rather than the sputtering economic engines that you have today in the EU and in the UK. That is not good for the world at all. We want EU and UK to recover their economic growth. And what is shocking is that even though ASEAN, the region I'm in, our GNP is only 1/5 that of the European Union, but in the decade 2010 to 2020, ASEAN added more to global economic growth than the European Union did. Now that shows how much the world has turned around.
Your narrative that you lay out in Living the Asian Century is also the narrative of Singapore. You were born poor and you've become a very distinguished diplomat, somebody who spent a lot of time in the United Nations, very successful writer, many particularly provocative and important books. Do you see your own life and the life of Singapore as intertwined? Do you see yourself symbolically as a kind of personal Singapore, and Singapore as a model for a Kishore Mahbubani kind of life?
Well, I think the Singapore success, I mean, clearly has been exceptional. I don't know of any other country that has gone from a per capita income of $500 to $88,000 in one lifetime. That's an amazing journey, by the way, that Singapore has undertaken. But I think it's important to see the Singapore story as being part of a larger Asian story that began a long time ago. If you had asked the architect of Singapore's economic miracle was a man that many people have not heard of. His name is Dr. Goh Keng Swee.
And I know Goh Keng Swee had a particular influence on you. You write extensively about it in the memoir.
He was a remarkable human being. He was so well-learned, so knowledgeable, and he asked himself a simple question: who were the first Asians to succeed? And the obvious answer, it was the Japanese. And why did the Japanese succeed? Well, the Japanese succeeded by going out to copy best practices from the rest of the world and bring it back to Japan. And so he says we must learn from Japan. And so in my writings, I suggest the secret formula of Singapore's success can be captured in a simple acronym called MPH. MPH doesn't stand for miles per hour. MPH stands for meritocracy, the selection of the best people to run the society; pragmatism, where you copy the best practices from any other country; and H stands for honesty, which of course is the hardest thing to do. And one of Singapore's...
Yeah, I take your point, Kishore, but you seem to be dodging the question a bit. I asked you about your own life. This new book is your own memoir. It's not really a book about Singapore. Is MPH also the story of your life, of a meritocracy, of honesty? Do you see yourself as kind of consciously or not, or coincidentally or not, a reflection, a mirror on the achievements of Singapore? Not everyone, of course, who grew up in Singapore has had your success, but you seem to be a particularly good exhibit of the Singapore miracle.
You're absolutely right. Let me answer your question very directly. Yes. I am a huge beneficiary of the success of Singapore.
But also a product.
I mean,
You're not just a
when
beneficiary.
no, yeah, exactly. But you see, but remember, when I grew up as a child, when I went to school at the age of 6, I was put on a special feeding program, and I had to go into the principal's office at recess time, and there was one pail of milk with one ladle, and all the 12 technically undernourished boys like me had to drink from the same ladle, the milk from a pail of milk. So that's where we came from. We didn't have a flush toilet. I live in a neighborhood where gangsters would fight each other with broken beer bottles. I described how I had to go to a coffee shop to bring back my father after he had fought with somebody with a broken beer bottle. So, that was a really rough third world childhood that I experienced. I mean, that it's important to emphasize that, frankly, I should never have gone to university. I shouldn't be sitting where I am today talking to you if not for the fact that Singapore did some remarkable developments, and I benefited from it enormously.
Has it ever occurred to you that had you been growing up in China, your life might have been much more tragic?
Well, yes. I mean, I think it would have been very difficult for me to achieve what I have achieved in my life, publishing 10 books, and many of them, as you know, in New York. If I hadn't had the kind of exposure that Singapore gave me. I mean, my 33 years as a diplomat, and I worked very closely with the 3 founding fathers of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, and I learned so much from them. They were absolutely brilliant individuals. And so I've had, in that sense, even though I had a very difficult childhood of poverty and stress, subsequently, I had a dream ride serving as a diplomat for Singapore, and I learned so much. And then, of course, being the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy was another big gift to my life.
Singapore, of course, is also, as you know, as well as anyone, an enormously controversial place. As you know, it's an economic miracle. I think it's the richest country now in the world, certainly the highest GDP, economic miracle. But it's controversial in its political context. You've talked about Lee Kuan Yew, really the founder of the country. Lots of criticisms of him and the system, that it isn't a democracy. You and I have talked about this previously. Is that just, again, anti-Asian, anti-Singaporean sentiment, or is there any truth to the fact that the Singapore model doesn't really allow free expression? There are all sorts of stories of people getting locked up and pushed out and persecuted for saying things that are against the grain in China. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, Andrew, because the important thing I want to emphasize is that Americans must give up looking at the world in black and white.
But it's not just Americans, Kishore.
No. It's actually, frankly, it's mostly Americans, because Europeans, in that sense, understand nuances better. They have lived through lots more in their history than Americans have. And many American liberals tend to portray the world in black and white terms. So Singapore was never a complete dictatorship, and certainly Singapore is not a liberal democracy like the United States of America. But you must accept the central fact that every 5 years the people voted freely for the government, and this is an important point. Even if you had sent 100,000 election observers into every Singapore election, it would have shown that the people freely chose the ruling party, which is, by the way, now the world's longest continually elected political party in the world today.
It's a one party. Would it be fair to call Singapore, and you're part of this, a one-party democracy, whatever that means? Maybe it's a contradictory term.
I would ask you to look at the headlines in the front page of today's Singapore Straits Times, where the new Prime Minister of Singapore, Lawrence Wong, we are lucky, we've always had good prime ministers, says openly that there's a danger of the PAP losing to the opposition. So, I mean, it is the opposition has been steadily gaining ground in Singapore, and the ruling party cannot win 90 to 95% of the votes. I think if it gets 60%, it's very happy. You know, it's not. There is a very determined group of people in Singapore who support the opposition. So it is, in that sense, a competitive political system in which the ruling party has to work hard to gain the support of the people, because they do not control the votes that go into the ballot box. That's the people who decide.
Does Singapore, in your view, offer a model for the developing world? I'm not sure that's a particularly politically correct statement these days, but for countries, particularly in the South, in Africa, in Latin America, and other parts of Asia, seeking to emulate the Singapore success, the Singapore miracle. Is the Singapore model, Kishore, different from the Chinese one in political and indeed economic terms?
Oh, it's hugely different from the Chinese model. Hugely different. You know, in China, by the way, they don't have elections every 5 years to select their leaders. They have their own, by the way, within the Chinese Communist Party, they have a very competitive political process that leads to the selection of leaders. They have a amazing, powerful meritocratic selection process within the Chinese Communist Party, but it's a very different model from Singapore, which is, by the way, closer to the Anglo-Saxon models of governance. If you look at the institutions of justice in Singapore, they are very much modeled on British and to some extent American systems of judicial systems. And here I want to emphasize, Singapore does not project itself as a model, but it is a reality. Whenever I travel around the world, and I travel around the world a lot, as you know, Andrew, so many countries want to find out why has Singapore been probably the most successful state in human history, because no other state in human history has lifted the living standards of its people as quickly and as comprehensively as Singapore has done so since its independence in 1965. You know, it's amazing, the Singapore success story. You know, I used to know the head of UNICEF. You know, he told me once, James Grant, he said, Kishore, don't talk about how you increase the economy of Singapore. Talk about how you reduce the infant mortality rates of Singapore faster than any other country has done in human history. Its social achievements are absolutely amazing. So in terms of, you know, we provide housing to 95% of the world of our citizenry own the homes that they live in, which is remarkable. You know, this is public housing on the best in the world that we have in Singapore. So there are many extraordinary achievements that Singapore has had that many other countries want to copy, and Singapore doesn't market itself. But I can tell you, wherever I travel, they keep asking me the question, what can we do to achieve a Singapore on our soil?
Is the Singapore model compatible with the one being developed perhaps in South Korea, but also particularly in Taiwan, perhaps a more democratic, but an untidier model? How would you compare what's happening in Taiwan with what's happened in Singapore? Taiwan, of course, is also in its own way an economic miracle, but perhaps it's politics, and obviously it's the complexity of its relations with China distinguishes it from Singapore.
Well, I mean, the important thing to emphasize is that Taiwan is not recognized as an independent country by the United Nations, as Singapore is. And Taiwan, as you know, most countries in the world state that they believe in a one China policy, which is that Taiwan and China are one country. Of course, you've got to resolve how you achieve that peaceful unification point in time. So Taiwan, the Taiwanese people, therefore, face an enormous challenge going forward on how to keep their autonomy and grow peacefully. So the Taiwanese have a very unique problem. And South Korea, of course, has grown, you're right, is another, and like Taiwan, like Singapore, is an economic miracle that has done amazingly well. In fact, South Korea used to be as poor as Singapore in the 1950s, with the per capita income as low as that of Ghana, of African countries, and now you have a South Korean absolutely amazing economic miracle. But the one thing that the South Koreans are trying very hard to achieve is some degree of political stability. Because unfortunately, and this is a very sad story, many South Korean presidents, after they leave office, have gone to jail, which is sad. It's a sign that it hasn't achieved a certain degree of political maturity, in terms of handling political transitions.
Are you suggesting, though, in your remarks about Taiwan, and I got a certain sort of chilling message that you're suggesting most people don't think that Taiwan is an independent state, that the fate of Taiwan should or inevitably will be like that of Hong Kong. Eventually, it will be digested back into China, for better or worse?
Well, I mean, I'm not giving a chilling portrayal of Taiwan, because even the United States of America does not recognize Taiwan as an independent state. You do not.
It might be chilling to our Taiwanese viewers, Kishore. I don't think they.
No, I think the Taiwanese people are more realistic than most people in the West give them credit for. You know that survey after survey will tell you that the Taiwanese people are opposed to the independence movement. They know that it is not realistic for Taiwan to become an independent political entity. I can tell you, I was in Taiwan, incidentally, a few months ago, and I gave a speech there, and I said that one of the blessings that the Taiwanese people have is that their passport has the name Republic of China, not Republic of Taiwan. And the Republic of China passport is recognized by 172 countries. And they can travel to 172 countries, the people of Taiwan. But if they throw away the Republic of China passport, which is based on the assumption that Taiwan and China are one country, and you replace it with a Republic of Taiwan passport, the Taiwanese will be very lucky if a sprinkling of countries recognize Taiwan as an independent country. And there's certain geopolitical realities that you cannot escape. And one of the lessons we have learned from recent times is that if you want to avoid wars, you must be geopolitically realistic. And let me just give you a simple example of our current Ukraine war, and certainly the Russian invasion.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Ukraine.
Yeah, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal. It should be condemned, no question whatsoever. But when the West imposed sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, the West should have noted that 85% of the world's population did not impose sanctions on Russia. 85%. In fact, many in the rest of the world, including China, India, and lots of third world countries, increased their trade with Russia after the Ukraine war began. So you must therefore develop a realistic understanding of the real balance of power in the world if you're going to achieve peace in our world today. And certainly, it's very important. I say this as a friend of the people of Taiwan. I don't want them to be at war. I want them to have a happy, peaceful future. But to have a happy, peaceful future, they have to be geopolitically very realistic about what they can do and what they cannot do.
Yeah, in undiplomatic language, Kishore, are you suggesting that the only happy future for Taiwan is being reincorporated back into China?
Well, I think there
are
ways and means for Taiwan to preserve its autonomy, to preserve its way of life, to preserve its openness to the rest of the world, while becoming perhaps nominally a part of the People's Republic of China. So there are ways and means.
I mean, some people fear that that kind of language was also articulated in terms of the future of Hong Kong, and that doesn't seem to have happened. So,
well, I think Hong Kong is a different case, very clearly. As you know, Hong Kong was a British colony that was seized by the British to begin the century of humiliation against China in 1842 after the Opium War. So the return of Hong Kong was inevitable as by the end of colonial rule. And in here, by the way, even in the case of Hong Kong, I believe that the British are making a huge mistake in not trying to support the autonomy of Hong Kong. You know, many people believe that Hong Kong has been completely snuffed out and it's dangerous to go there. That's not true. I just spent 2 weeks in Hong Kong in August this year. And most of the Hong Kongers' ways of life hasn't changed significantly since 1997. And just go there and see what it's like.
You've mentioned the United Nations a few times in this conversation, Kishore. Much of your illustrious career has been spent within the UN. You were the Singapore permanent representative there between 1984 and 1989. As you know, Trump in particular is no great fan of the United Nations. In what you call the Asian century, what is the fate of the United Nations? Can the United Nations be reinvented, reborn, re-strengthened in this Asian century? At the moment, it doesn't seem to have a great deal of significance. Of course, it's based in New York, which might itself be a contradiction in terms. Are you bullish on the future of the United Nations, and how does it connect with the Asian century?
Well, I belong to an endangered species called the UN lover. I love the United Nations. I believe that the United Nations is absolutely indispensable. It's the only universally respected international organization in the world. And by the way, I want to emphasize one fact that every American citizen should know, which is that membership of the United Nations is completely voluntary. If you want to leave, you can leave at any point in time. And you know what? No country has left the United Nations.
Yeah, but because
not the United States, not Israel, not South Korea, not Singapore. No. We all want to be members of the United Nations. And remember, we are becoming a small global village. That's the biggest reality of our times. We are a small global village. In any village, you need village councils to run the village. And the only universally respected global village council that we have is the United Nations. And you're right, the United Nations has been underperforming. I completely agree. But the reason why it has been underperforming is that the 5 permanent members who run the UN Security Council and therefore make the big decisions for the UN have always picked spineless people to be the Secretary Generals of the UN. And if you're going to pick a spineless person to be a Secretary General of the UN, the CEO, then it's quite natural for
is the current Secretary General of the UN is he spineless?
Well, I think he was picked because he was spineless. But then, of course, as you know, some Secretary Generals surprise. And when I worked with Kofi Annan showed himself to be a very brave and astute Secretary General who could achieve a lot, And the present Secretary General has now got to show how he provides leadership by defending the United Nations when Donald Trump carries out actions against the UN. So this is a test. The real test of the leadership of the current Secretary General will come over the next few years, and the world will see whether he stands up to this task or whether he melts under pressure.
But there is a connection, Kishore, between what seems to be the increasing lawlessness of the international system, whether it's in Ukraine or Gaza, or perhaps even this brewing war in the South China Sea, and the decline of the UN. Could one argue that we need new kinds of organizations, that the UN is past its due date? I mean, you're nostalgic, but you said, as you've acknowledged, you're in a tiny minority of people who still love the UN. For most people, it's entirely irrelevant. It doesn't seem to have achieved anything. You've mentioned global warming. It's failed on that front. Trump even rejects the idea of global warming and wants to pull the United States out of all international agreements, UN or otherwise, on global warming.
Well, I must tell your audience that I'm not a pessimist about the future of the world. I don't agree with your assessment that the world is becoming more lawless. If you look at it statistically, despite the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, which are very painful and very should be stopped as quickly as possible, still the long-term trend is that less and less people are dying from wars. And by the way, I want to emphasize this fact that even though the greatest changes of power are taking place in East Asia, especially with the emergence of China, we have seen no major wars in East Asia for 45 years. So there are many parts of the world that are managing to grow and develop without fighting wars. So it is not true that the world at large is becoming more lawless. And actually, if you look at it objectively, thanks to the United Nations, by the way, we are adopting all kinds of new conventions that are now regulating how we collaborate in many areas, like in intellectual property, for example. It's a UN organization that determines how we collaborate on intellectual property. And soon, by the way, the world will have to find ways and means of regulating artificial intelligence. And I guarantee you that when you have a new convention, global convention, on how to regulate artificial intelligence, it will be endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly, because that is the only universal body that can legitimize global decisions. So there are many parts of the world are still functioning very well, and so in Asia, most Asians are actually very optimistic about the future. You want to meet the most optimistic young people in the world, come to China, come to Southeast Asia, come to India. And I'll give you one statistic so you understand why we are optimistic in these, what I call the CIA countries, China, India, ASEAN. The total population is 3.5 billion people. Out of these 3.5 billion people in the year 2000, there were only 150 million people enjoying middle-class living standards. Only 150 million out of 3.5 billion in the year 2000. But by 2020, that number of 150 million had exploded 10 times to 1.5 billion. And by 2030, you'll reach the amount of 2.5 to 3 billion out of 3.5 billion people will be enjoying middle-class living standards. Now, this is the largest increase in the middle-class population of humanity since human history began. In that sense, we are living in one of the most promising times of human history, which is also what I try to convey in Living the Asian Century. We have lots of reasons to be optimistic for the world.
Finally, Kishore, you've been very generous with your time. I really appreciate it. Your new book, Living the Asian Century, an Undiplomatic Memoir, is the story of your life. It's been a remarkable life, a remarkably successful life. And it, as I said, as we've talked earlier, it mirrors the remarkable success of Singapore. You've traveled the world, you're a best-selling writer, diplomat, teacher, you debate around the world. Do you have any regrets about your life? Do you have regrets about roads not taken, decisions which were mistaken? What's the biggest mistake of your life?
Well, I can tell you there's the biggest mistake in my life. The one thing I deeply, deeply regret is that when my children were growing up, especially when they were teenagers, I was so busy with my career that I did not spend time with my children. If you ask me to redial my life and go back to where I was, let's say 30, 40 years ago, when my children were being born in 86, 88, and 1990, I look back now, I wish that I spent more time with them when they were children. I really missed out on their childhood, and that's the biggest regret of my life.
And is that a selfish regret, or do you think your children also didn't benefit from that?
Well, unfortunately, my 3 children are doing very well. So, despite my neglect, they had the world's best mother. So, it compensated for the fact that they had an absent father for many years.
Well, you clearly made a good decision when it came to romance, Kishore. You chose the right woman. Does she feature finally in the book, Living the Asian Century? Do you credit her? Is there always a very remarkable woman behind a remarkable fellow like yourself?
Absolutely, and I think I say somewhere in the book that one of the strange things about my life is that I've accumulated a lot of detractors, and one of the detractors actually once said to a group of people whom I know, saying we were on the verge of destroying Kishore, and then you know what, he married Anne, and then we lost. So my detractors acknowledge that my wife is my strongest source of support in my life.
Well, Kishore Mahbubani, it's always a pleasure and honor to have you on the show. You are, in your own way, both simultaneously diplomatic and profoundly undiplomatic. I think there's a certain uniqueness to that ability. I don't quite know how you pull it off, but you do. And good luck with everything. We'll have you back on the show, Kishore. So much more to talk about. Your arguments about the Asian century, I think, are quite compelling, but also for some people, quite chilling. So we will talk in the not too distant future. Congratulations on the new book and enjoy your Asian century.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Always a pleasure to be with you.